The night was bitterly cold, and Grace Miller clutched her worn coat tighter around her thin frame as her stomach growled in painful hunger. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days, and the hollow emptiness inside her felt heavier with every passing hour. As she walked past glowing restaurants filled with warmth, laughter, and the clinking of glasses, her heart ached, not just for food, but for a place where she belonged. What she didn't know was that a simple mistake, a single moment of sitting at the wrong table, would change her life forever. That night, fate wasn't just about to feed her, it was about to rewrite her destiny. Grace pushed open the door of the bistro, the warmth and scent of roasted chicken instantly flooding her senses. For a moment she hesitated, her clothes were worn, her shoes scuffed, and her presence seemed so out of place among the polished diners. But hunger pressed her forward, and she slipped into the crowd, hoping no one would notice. In her daze, she slid into the first empty chair she spotted. She didn't realize the table was already set with gleaming silverware and 2 tall glasses of sparkling water. She didn't notice the reservation card tucked discreetly beside the candle. To her, it was just a chair, an invitation to rest. She leaned back, letting the heat seep into her bones. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to belong in a place like this. Moments later, the bistro doors swung open again, and in walked Daniel Brooks. Tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, with sharp features that carried both strength and weariness, Daniel was the kind of man who turned heads without trying. At his side was a small girl, Sophie, about 6 years old, her blonde curls bouncing as she skipped, clutching a stuffed rabbit to her chest. "Daddy, I'm starving," Sophie whispered loudly, tugging on his hand. Daniel smiled faintly and guided her toward their reserved table. But when he arrived, his expression hardened. There, sitting at their table, was a stranger, a young woman with tired eyes, staring down at the tablecloth as if afraid to be seen. "This table is reserved," Daniel said, his voice cool, authoritative, the kind that commanded boardrooms and silenced opposition. Grace's head snapped up, her face flushing with embarrassment. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I'll leave." She scrambled to her feet, gripping her coat tightly, her dignity unraveling with every step toward the door. But before she could escape, a small voice stopped her. "Daddy, wait." Sophie's big blue eyes followed Grace with a kind of innocent curiosity only children carried. "She looks hungry. Can't she stay with us?" Daniel hesitated, caught off guard by his daughter's plea. The businessman in him wanted to say no, to brush off the awkward intrusion and move on. But the father in him saw the sincerity in Sophie's eyes. For a brief moment, his hardened exterior cracked. "Sit," he said finally, his tone softer, though still edged with caution. Grace froze, torn between pride and desperation. But the hunger gnawed louder than her shame, and slowly, she lowered herself back into the chair. The waiter appeared, surprised to see 3 instead of 2. Daniel ordered without hesitation, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and warm bread. Grace kept her gaze low, hands trembling as she folded them in her lap. Sophie leaned forward, whispering conspiratorially, "Don't worry. Daddy always orders too much food anyway." For the first time that night, Grace smiled. The meal arrived steaming hot, and the moment the first bite touched Grace's lips, her composure cracked. She hadn't realized how weak she had become until warmth spread through her body with each mouthful. She tried to eat slowly, politely, but the hunger betrayed her, and she swallowed hard, fighting back tears. Daniel watched in silence, his sharp gaze softening as he noticed the way her hands shook, the way her eyes glistened. Sophie, meanwhile, giggled and offered Grace a piece of bread from her own plate. "Thank you," Grace whispered, her voice breaking. After a long pause, Daniel finally spoke. "What's your name?" "Grace," she answered quietly. "And what brings you to sitting at strangers' tables?" His tone was measured, but not unkind. Grace's throat tightened. She wanted to lie, to protect the last fragments of her pride. But something about the little girl's open face, something about the warmth of the food in her stomach, unraveled her defenses. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted. "I lost my job. Couldn't keep up with rent. I've been sleeping wherever I can. Tonight, I just wanted to feel normal. To feel like I belonged somewhere." Silence stretched across the table. The noise of the restaurant seemed far away. Daniel's eyes lingered on her, searching, assessing. She braced for judgment, but instead he leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You don't need pity," he said finally. "You need an opportunity." Grace blinked, confused. "I run a company," Daniel continued. "Brooks and Company. Enterprises. We're looking for someone in administration. It's entry level, but it's steady work. If you're willing to show up, work hard, and prove yourself, the position is yours. Her fork clattered against the plate. She stared at him, stunned. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. Daniel glanced at Sophie, who was happily humming as she spread butter on her bread. His voice softened. Because sometimes the right people come into our lives by mistake. Tears blurred Grace's vision. For the first time in a long while, hope stirred inside her chest. The next morning, Grace stood nervously outside a tall glass building in downtown Manhattan. Brooks and Company. Enterprises gleamed across the entrance, the kind of place she once only admired from afar, wondering what kind of lives existed behind its polished doors. Now, unbelievably, she was about to step inside. She smoothed her thrift store blouse, borrowed from a shelter, and whispered a silent prayer. Don't mess this up, Grace. This is your chance. Inside the lobby, marble floors stretched endlessly, and employees in sleek suits hurried past, their heels clicking like clockwork. Grace felt small, painfully aware of her second-hand shoes. The receptionist eyed her curiously, but, after a phone call upstairs, directed her to the elevator. When the doors opened on the top floor, Daniel Brooks was waiting. He stood tall, composed, though there was a flicker of something softer in his eyes when he saw her. You came, he said, almost as if he hadn't been sure she would. Grace nodded, clutching her worn bag. I said I would. Daniel gestured for her to follow. Then let's get you started. He introduced her to the administrative staff, a group of polished professionals whose polite smiles masked judgment. Grace felt their glances, the quiet whispers. She pretended not to notice, focusing instead on Daniel's calm voice as he explained her duties. Paperwork, scheduling, answering phones, he said. It's nothing glamorous, but it's honest work. Prove yourself here, Grace, and doors will open. Her heart swelled with determination. She had been given a chance, and she wasn't about to waste it. The first few hours were overwhelming. Endless phone calls, complicated filing systems, unfamiliar software. Grace stumbled more than once, her fingers trembling on the keyboard. Some co-workers smirked, but she kept her head down, refusing to let her nerves get the better of her. During lunch, she slipped away to a quiet corner with a simple sandwich Sophie had insisted she take home the night before. As she ate, she thought about the little girl's kindness. Sophie's bright smile had been the first spark of warmth she'd felt in months. By the end of the day, Grace was exhausted, but when Daniel passed by her desk, he paused. How was your first day? Hard, she admitted honestly. But good. Really good. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself a small smile. Good. That's what I wanted to hear. Days turned into weeks. Grace's hands grew steadier, her confidence stronger. She arrived early, stayed late, and absorbed everything like a sponge. The same co-workers who had once whispered about her now came to her desk for help, impressed by her efficiency and quiet determination. One afternoon, as she was sorting documents, Sophie bounded into the office, her laughter filling the air like sunlight. She ran straight to Grace, wrapping her small arms around her waist. Grace! Daddy said I could visit today. Grace knelt, hugging her back. You made my whole day better, Sophie. Daniel watched the interaction from his office door. For weeks, he had noticed how different things felt with Grace around. Sophie was happier, lighter. And he himself, he couldn't deny the way Grace's resilience stirred something inside him, something he hadn't felt since his wife passed away years ago. Later that evening, as Grace was gathering her things, Daniel stopped her. You've been doing good work, he said. Better than I expected. Grace flushed. Thank you. That means a lot. He hesitated, then added. And Sophie, she's grown attached to you. Grace smiled softly. She's special. I think she's the one giving me strength. Their eyes lingered on each other for a moment longer than either intended. There was no need for words. The quiet connection between them said enough. But just as hope was beginning to bloom, trouble found its way in. At a corporate event weeks later, Grace attended with Daniel and Sophie by his side. She wore a simple dress Daniel had insisted on providing, though she had protested. She still felt out of place among the city's wealthiest, but Sophie clung to her hand as if she belonged. That's when a sharp voice cut through the chatter. Daniel Brooks, always full of surprises. A tall man approached, his suit tailored, his smirk sharp. It was Richard Calloway, one of Daniel's longtime rivals. His eyes flicked to Grace, scanning her with disdain. And who is this? Richard sneered. A new assistant? Or perhaps something else? Grace's cheeks burned, humiliation clawing at her. She wanted to disappear, to shrink into the floor. But before she could respond, Daniel's arm shifted protectively around her shoulders. "This is Grace Miller," he said firmly. "An employee of mine. And someone I respect." Richard's smirk faltered at Daniel's tone, but the damage was done. Whispers rippled through the crowd, judgmental eyes settling on Grace. That night, when they returned home, Grace's chest ached with doubt. She had worked so hard, yet she still felt like the world saw her as nothing more than a mistake at the wrong table. But Daniel's words replayed in her mind, "Someone I respect." And for the first time in her life, she began to believe she might actually be worthy of that respect. The weeks after the corporate event tested Grace in ways she hadn't expected. Whispers about her past lingered, though few dared speak openly. Still, she felt the weight of every sideways glance, every hushed conversation that fell silent when she entered the room. But instead of retreating, Grace pressed harder. She worked late into the evenings, learning the company's systems, volunteering for projects no one else wanted. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. She was no longer just the mysterious young woman at Daniel Brooks' side. She was a competent employee who earned respect through perseverance. One evening, as the office emptied, Grace was still at her desk, eyes heavy as she reviewed contracts. The door creaked, and she looked up to find Sophie running in, her little feet pattering against the floor. "Grace!" Sophie beamed, carrying a piece of paper. "I drew this for you." Grace took the paper gently. It was a crayon drawing of 3 figures, Sophie, Daniel, and Grace, holding hands under a sun with smiling faces. Tears pricked Grace's eyes. "It's our family," Sophie explained proudly. "Daddy says family means the people who care about you. That means you too." Grace's voice caught in her throat. She hugged Sophie tightly, whispering, "Thank you, sweetheart. That means more than you know." Daniel arrived moments later, watching them quietly from the doorway. He had grown accustomed to seeing Sophie smile when Grace was around. It was a light he thought he'd lost forever after his wife's death. Later that night, when Grace finally left the office, Daniel offered her a ride. In the quiet hum of the car, she spoke softly. "Why are you doing all this for me, Daniel? You've given me a job, a chance. You let me into your daughter's life. You didn't have to." Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. He stared ahead for a long moment before answering. "Because I know what it feels like to lose everything. And because Sophie, she sees something in you. Something I'd be a fool to ignore." Grace turned to him, her heart pounding. There was a vulnerability in his voice she hadn't heard before, and it echoed the ache in her own soul. As winter deepened, so did their bond. Grace became not only an essential part of the office, but a constant presence in Daniel and Sophie's lives. She often joined them for dinners, helped Sophie with school projects, and filled their once quiet apartment with laughter. But with closeness came fear. Grace often lay awake at night in her small rented room, staring at the ceiling. What if this is temporary? What if I don't belong here? Her fears nearly came true one evening when Richard Calloway reappeared. He had not forgotten the humiliation at the corporate event, and his bitterness had only grown. He cornered Grace in the lobby after work, his tone dripping with venom. "You think you belong here?" he sneered. "You're nothing but a charity case Daniel parades around to feel noble. Do you really believe this world will ever accept someone like you?" Grace's chest tightened. Old wounds reopened, the voice of every person who had ever doubted her echoing in her head. She wanted to fight back, but the words wouldn't come. She simply lowered her gaze and hurried past, her pride shattered. That night at dinner, Sophie noticed Grace's silence. "Are you okay?" the little girl asked, her big eyes filled with concern. Grace forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart." But Daniel wasn't convinced. After Sophie went to bed, he confronted Grace. "What happened?" She hesitated, then confessed, voice trembling. "Richard. He said I don't belong here. And maybe he's right. Maybe I don't." Daniel's eyes hardened, anger flickering beneath his calm exterior. He stepped closer, his voice firm but gentle. "Listen to me, Grace. You belong here because you've earned it. You've worked harder than anyone. And Sophie, she adores you. Do you understand? Don't ever let people like Richard decide your worth." Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks, but this time they weren't from shame. They were from the strange, overwhelming comfort of being defended, of being seen. For years, she had carried her battles alone. But now, for the first time, she realized she wasn't alone anymore. The morning after Daniel's conversation with Grace, the atmosphere in the Brooks household shifted ever so slightly. Sophie woke up with an energy Daniel hadn't seen in weeks. She bounced out of bed, her little feet pattering across the wooden floor as she ran into the kitchen. Daniel was flipping pancakes, a rare treat, his black coffee steaming beside him. Sophie's smile was wide, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Daddy, can I bring Mommy flowers today?" she asked, tugging gently at his sleeve. Daniel froze, spatula in hand. He looked down at his daughter, her innocent eyes filled with hope. It was the kind of question that twisted his heart. He knelt, brushing her hair back gently. "Sweetheart, Mommy's not here to see them, but if you want, we can still get flowers together. We can put them in the living room, just like she used to." Sophie thought for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, but they'll still be for her." Daniel hugged her tightly, closing his eyes against the ache in his chest. Grace's presence had stirred memories Sophie was too young to process on her own. But it also sparked something new, a way for them to keep Grace alive in small gestures. Later that afternoon, Daniel walked into Brooks and Company with his briefcase and a heavy heart. The past weeks had been a balancing act between rebuilding his company and nurturing Sophie's fragile world. The board of directors eyed him with skepticism as he entered the meeting room. Some had already whispered that his grief had weakened his leadership. But Daniel had prepared. He presented a new vision, one rooted in community values, empathy, and corporate responsibility. Instead of focusing only on profit margins, he proposed initiatives that invested in local families and small businesses. His voice was steady, though inside he trembled, thinking of Grace and how she had always believed in kindness before ambition. As he wrapped up, silence lingered. Then slowly a few nodded. Others leaned forward, intrigued. By the time he finished, Daniel knew something had shifted. For the first time in months, the room wasn't filled with doubt. It was filled with possibility. After the meeting, Daniel stepped outside into the city air, the buzz of New York life wrapping around him. He loosened his tie and exhaled. Just then, his phone buzzed. A picture message from Sophie's teacher appeared. It was Sophie in class, proudly holding up a drawing of her family. 3 stick figures stood together, her, Daniel, and Grace, smiling under a sun. Daniel's throat tightened. He knew Sophie still longed for the wholeness they'd lost, but in that drawing, she had included Grace as if she were still beside them. For Sophie, the family wasn't broken, it was just different. That evening, Grace arrived at their apartment for dinner. She carried a casserole dish, the aroma of baked pasta filling the air as soon as she stepped inside. Sophie clapped her hands with delight and rushed to hug her. Daniel watched from the doorway, his chest warming at the sight. The 3 of them sat together, the table lit by a simple candle Sophie insisted on lighting. Grace laughed softly as Sophie told her about the flowers they had bought earlier. Daniel joined in the laughter, though part of him still held back, unsure how much of this closeness he deserved. But as Grace glanced at him across the table, her eyes soft and unwavering, Daniel felt a spark of something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time: hope. The weeks that followed unfolded like the slow bloom of spring after a long, bitter winter. For Daniel, each day still carried shadows of grief, but now those shadows were softened by light that came from Sophie's laughter and from Grace's quiet, steady presence. One Saturday morning, the 3 of them went to Central Park. Sophie ran ahead, chasing pigeons with carefree giggles that echoed through the air. Daniel and Grace walked side by side, their steps falling into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Daniel carried Sophie's little backpack, while Grace held a thermos of hot cocoa she had prepared. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to simply exist in that peace. The wind rustled through the trees, the sunlight glistened on the pond, and Sophie's joy was pure, unburdened. Grace turned to him, her auburn hair catching the morning light. "You're doing better than you think," she said softly. Daniel's throat tightened. "Most days, I still feel like I'm failing her." "You're not," Grace replied, her gaze unwavering. "You're teaching her that love doesn't end. It changes shape, but it never disappears." That evening, back at the apartment, Sophie insisted they all bake cookies together. Flour dusted the counters, laughter filled the kitchen, and Sophie's cheeks were streaked with chocolate smudges. Daniel found himself laughing too, a deep, unrestrained laugh he hadn't felt in years. Later, when Sophie was asleep, Daniel stood on the balcony with Grace. The city glowed beneath them, alive with endless motion. Grace leaned against the railing, her hands clasped around a mug of tea. "She loves you," Daniel said quietly, glancing back toward Sophie's room. Grace smiled. "I love her too." And, she hesitated, her eyes meeting his, steady and vulnerable all at once. "I care about you, Daniel. More than I expected I would." Daniel's breath caught. For so long, he had shut his heart away, convinced it had no right to open again. But in that moment, with Grace's words hanging in the cool night air, something inside him softened. He reached out, covering her hand with his. "You've given us more than I can ever thank you for," he murmured. I don't know what the future looks like, but I want you in it. Grace's eyes shimmered. No more words were needed. They stood in silence, their hands entwined, the city lights stretching out like stars around them. A month later, Daniel and Sophie visited Grace's classroom for a special event. Sophie was bursting with excitement, clutching a handmade card she had decorated with hearts and flowers. When it was her turn to speak in front of the class, Sophie held up the card and announced proudly, "This is for Miss Miller. She's my favorite person besides Daddy. She makes us smile again." The classroom erupted in applause, but Daniel could only stare at his daughter, overwhelmed. Grace's eyes glistened as she knelt to accept the card. Sophie hugged her tightly, and Daniel knew then, it wasn't just about healing anymore. It was about building something new. That night, Daniel tucked Sophie into bed. She clutched her favorite stuffed animal and whispered, "Daddy, are we a family again now?" Daniel's chest ached at her words, but this time, it was a sweet ache. He kissed her forehead and replied, "Yes, sweetheart. We always were. And now our family is just growing." As he turned off the light, Sophie smiled in the dark, comforted by an answer she had longed to hear. Daniel stepped out into the living room, where Grace waited with a quiet smile. For the first time since losing his wife, Daniel felt that his home was full again, not because the past had been replaced, but because love had found a way to expand. And in that realization, he understood. Grace hadn't just helped him survive his grief. She had given him and Sophie permission to dream of a future where joy could live alongside memory, and where love, once lost, could be rediscovered in new and beautiful forms.